They called him a fraud. A 34-year-old soldier from Ouagadougou, dismissed by the French press as a militant with delusions of grandeur. European diplomats warned that his defiance of the CFA franc would bring legal consequences. One even threatened sanctions if he continued pushing what they mockingly called new African money. But Ibrahim Traoré didn't flinch. While the world tried to box him in with labels and threats, he quietly rewrote the rules. In one televised speech, without a single bullet fired, he shattered decades of dependency. What followed wasn't chaos, it was the birth of African unity, rooted in self-reliance and economic dignity. If you believe in truth, courage, and the rise of a new Africa, then this is the channel for you. We share real stories, powerful moments, and bold leadership, like that of Ibrahim Traoré, who stands for unity, dignity, and African self-reliance. If this message speaks to your heart, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with others who believe in a stronger, freer Africa. Your voice matters. Together, we amplify it. Let's make sure the world hears the roar of a continent reclaiming its future. They called him reckless. A radical. A boy in uniform pretending to be a president. When Captain Ibrahim Traoré announced Burkina Faso's intention to challenge the CFA franc and replace it with a sovereign system nicknamed New African Money, the backlash was immediate. French media outlets ran headlines calling him economically illiterate. European diplomats warned of legal consequences if he continued down what they called a dangerous path. The IMF and World Bank sent stern letters, reminding the young leader that international agreements must be honored. Some even went so far as to suggest that his actions could isolate Burkina Faso entirely from global financial markets. But what they misunderstood, perhaps willfully, was that Traoré was not acting alone. His voice carried the frustrations of millions across the continent who had lived under the shadow of currency dependency and debt diplomacy. What Western leaders called reckless, African youth called brave. What the global financial elite labeled as destabilizing, citizens saw as a necessary act of liberation. Traoré had not set out to disrupt the system for the sake of defiance, he simply refused to be complicit in the quiet theft of his nation's future. Instead of backing down, he leaned in. In a surprise national address, he released a full audit of Burkina Faso's public accounts, exposing years of mismanagement under French-backed regimes. The data was clear, the evidence irrefutable. The money had always flowed out, not in. And with that revelation, the narrative began to shift. The world expected a confrontation. What they got was a quiet revolution. A financial awakening. A 34-year-old captain challenging the very foundation of post-colonial economics, and daring the rest of Africa to follow. At first, they laughed. Financial analysts in Paris dismissed the idea as symbolic bravado. Macron's advisors scoffed in private meetings, convinced that Ibrahim Traoré's plan for a sovereign African currency, what the Burkinabe called New African Money, would collapse before it even left the drawing board. Some went further. The French Ministry of Finance hinted that any attempt to bypass the CFA system could trigger automatic economic penalties. One leaked internal memo even labeled Traoré as a monetary insurgent, suggesting his actions might qualify as violations of international banking protocols. Western think tanks began to speculate whether ECOWAS or the IMF would have to intervene to restore fiscal sanity. But Traoré wasn't shaken. He understood the game being played, how language could be used as a weapon more insidious than any gun. By painting him as erratic or dangerous, they hoped to undermine the legitimacy of his leadership before his message gained traction. What they didn't anticipate was how deeply that message would resonate, not just in Burkina Faso, but across an entire continent desperate for change. Rather than respond with confrontation, Traoré doubled down on transparency. He invited regional economists, Pan-African historians, and independent journalists to join a public commission on monetary reform. Every meeting was broadcast live. No backroom deals. No diplomatic filters. He broke down complex financial concepts for the people, explaining how colonial currencies, trade imbalances, and foreign-controlled reserves had drained Africa of its wealth for decades. The public was shocked. And then they were angry. Not at Traoré, but at the system they had never been taught to question. Within months, what began as one man's bold vision turned into a growing coalition. Mali and Guinea sent delegations to Ouagadougou. Students from Dakar to Kinshasa began holding forums on self-reliance and African economic unity. Artists painted murals of Traoré holding broken chains, children wore t-shirts that read, "Our money, our future." It was no longer just about currency, it was about dignity. And then came the turning point. A respected economist from the University of Oxford, long critical of African populism, published a stunning op-ed. In it, he wrote, "I may not agree with all of Traoré's methods, but I cannot deny the clarity of his vision. For the first time in decades, a leader is asking Africa not what it needs from the world, but what the world owes Africa." The narrative was shifting. The threats of sanctions now seemed petty. The accusations of incompetence, baseless. Traoré hadn't just launched a financial reform. He had started a moral reckoning. And in doing so, he exposed a truth the world was not ready to face. That African unity, built on self-reliance and economic sovereignty, was not only possible, but inevitable. At a high-level economic summit in Accra, Traoré was invited, but only as an observer. Western diplomats insisted that Burkina Faso's financial reforms were too experimental to warrant a formal seat at the table. Behind closed doors, some participants referred to him mockingly as the rebel in fatigues, implying he was out of his depth among polished economists and seasoned ministers. A leaked transcript from the pre-conference meeting even suggested that if Traoré brought up new African money, organizers would cut the live stream and move discussions to private chambers. They feared his words would stir something far more dangerous than rebellion, hope. On the first day of the summit, Traoré sat silently in the back row, without a microphone, without a placard. The audience turned their attention to the keynote speakers. Finance ministers from former colonial powers, technocrats from the IMF, and consultants who spoke in jargon-laced presentations about sustainable debt strategies and regional liquidity harmonization. The language was elegant, the charts impressive, but the room felt disconnected from the street markets, villages, and overcrowded schools that made up the real Africa. Then, something unexpected happened. A delegate from Guinea broke protocol. She stood and asked, "Why is the only leader proposing self-reliance not allowed to speak?" The room fell silent. A few scattered claps turned into thunderous applause. Cameras turned to Traoré. Organizers hesitated, but the pressure was too great. They handed him a microphone. Traoré didn't raise his voice. He didn't accuse or blame. He simply told the story of a country tired of waiting for permission to be free. He spoke of farmers trading goods without needing foreign banks, of local engineers designing mobile payment systems backed by community gold reserves, of students learning Pan-African economics instead of colonial theories. He laid out a future where African unity wasn't a dream, but a design. And he ended with one line that would echo beyond the hall: "We don't need validation from institutions that once enslaved us. We need only to believe in each other." The summit was never the same. Journalists flooded social media with his quotes. Delegates from Senegal, Togo, and even South Africa requested private meetings. The live stream numbers skyrocketed. Headlines the next day didn't mention the IMF's debt models, they focused on the man who, from the back of the room, reshaped the conversation. The ones who had laughed now looked uneasy. Those who had excluded him now sought collaboration. And the people, watching from cafes and smartphones across the continent, saw something that hadn't been visible in years: a leader who didn't beg for a seat at the table, he built a new one. That was the power of new African money. Not just in currency, but in courage. Not just in numbers, but in narrative. Ibrahim Traoré had changed the summit. But more importantly, he had changed what Africa dared to imagine. When the European Union's Economic Council released its quarterly bulletin, it included a veiled warning aimed directly at Burkina Faso. Though no country was named, the language was clear: nations pursuing unilateral currency experiments may risk diplomatic isolation, economic retaliation, and suspension from international partnerships. The statement was met with subtle applause in Brussels and Paris. Western financial analysts interpreted it as a direct message to Ibrahim Traoré and his New African Money initiative. French television panels described Traoré as a naive populist risking his country's future for ideological theater. Commentators questioned his education, his legitimacy, even his mental stability, masking condescension behind technocratic concern. But in Ouagadougou, Traoré didn't issue a rebuttal. Instead, he unveiled something that would leave those critics scrambling for explanations. He announced the creation of a regional monetary innovation hub, led not by bureaucrats, but by young African fintech developers, economists, and blockchain experts. The project wasn't just theoretical. It was already operational. In 5 cities across Burkina Faso, test markets had begun circulating a digital version of the local currency, backed by gold reserves and transparent ledgers accessible to every citizen via mobile app. It wasn't just currency reform, it was infrastructural revolution. As this bold experiment gained momentum, neighboring countries took notice. Delegations from Mali, Sierra Leone, and Chad visited these pilot cities, witnessing how local businesses now operated without dependence on the CFA franc. Farmers received real-time payments. Small shop owners tracked income digitally. Transaction fees, often siphoned off by foreign banks, had been reduced to near zero. It was a practical form of self-reliance, not just policy rhetoric. And more importantly, it was working. The backlash came quickly. A prominent European think tank released a report labeling the initiative as economically irresponsible and a threat to regional stability. France's foreign minister suggested in a press briefing that such digital currencies could facilitate terror financing, a coded accusation often used to delegitimize African autonomy. The message was clear: independence was dangerous, unless it followed Western rules. But the data told another story. In just 4 months, the participating regions had seen a 23% increase in local trade activity and a measurable decline in foreign currency dependence. Surveys revealed a dramatic rise in citizen trust toward the government. The same youth once disillusioned with politics now logged into forums to offer feedback, propose solutions, and volunteer for tech training programs. Ibrahim Traoré didn't clap back at his critics. He didn't need to. His silence was filled with progress. Each accusation hurled at him was drowned out by the noise of construction sites, the hum of local markets, the chatter of schoolchildren learning African history written by African hands. The world had tried to frame him as a mistake. But through action, through new African money, he had become a model. A blueprint. A quiet revolution in real time. At the United Nations General Assembly, an African diplomat from a former colonial power took the stage and spoke with a polished tone that cloaked deep disdain. Without naming him directly, he criticized irresponsible military regimes that were poisoning regional trust by introducing illegitimate currencies and undermining financial cooperation. The audience, largely Western, nodded in agreement. The implication was obvious. The target was Ibrahim Traoré and his radical experiment, New African Money. In private corridors, European delegates chuckled over dinner, confident that Burkina Faso's so-called economic revolution would soon collapse under its own weight. Some even predicted famine, social unrest, and another coup to remove the idealistic captain. But once again, the world miscalculated. Back in Burkina Faso, Traoré had already moved to the next phase. What began as a test in a handful of cities had grown into a national transformation strategy. The digital currency, backed by local gold reserves and managed by a decentralized system of African tech specialists, was being used in over 60% of domestic transactions. This wasn't just reform, it was infrastructure reborn. Markets no longer relied on the CFA franc, which had for decades tied their fate to a foreign central bank in Paris. Instead, people now exchanged, saved, and invested with a tool created in their own image. But the most powerful shift wasn't economic. It was psychological. For the first time, citizens no longer saw themselves as merely surviving within a system they didn't build. They were participating in something bold, something that made them feel seen. At schools, teachers began using Traoré's currency model as part of the mathematics curriculum. In universities, entire departments emerged around the themes of Pan-African economics, decentralized finance, and monetary sovereignty. The phrase self-reliance wasn't just policy, it was identity. Still, global institutions were not finished. The World Bank quietly delayed a major infrastructure loan to Burkina Faso, citing technical misalignment. The IMF reduced its cooperation footprint, warning of regulatory anomalies. A G7 communiqué warned of financial instability in West Africa, slyly attributing it to digital currency proliferation. But behind these diplomatic phrases was a simple truth, a fear that if Burkina Faso succeeded, others would follow. Traoré was never just building currency, he was building defiance. That defiance soon rippled across borders. In Mali, officials began exploratory talks with Traoré's monetary advisors. Guinea's transitional government launched their own sovereign payment platform based on Burkina Faso's code. In Senegal, student protests erupted, not against their government, but in support of it, demanding a total exit from the CFA zone. In Nigeria, where distrust of traditional banking was already high, grassroots tech groups requested open-source access to Traoré's systems. It wasn't a chain reaction. It was a signal fire. The Western media scrambled. They ran editorials warning about economic tribalism and the fragmentation of African markets. They described Traoré as an opportunist exploiting Pan-African nostalgia. But on the ground, African unity was no longer abstract. It was a growing network of collaboration, trade, and mutual respect, designed and led by Africans themselves. Traoré's most brilliant move wasn't technical, it was cultural. He insisted that all designs, policies, and terms be explained in simple language and translated into local dialects. He met not only with economists, but with griots, village elders, and market women. In one televised session, he sat with a group of rural mothers and asked, "How would you design a currency you trust?" Their answers weren't academic, but they were revolutionary. Stability, transparency, and the ability to feed their children. That became the new standard. Meanwhile, the legal threats mounted. International courts debated whether Burkina Faso's withdrawal from prior monetary treaties constituted a breach of contract. French banks began rejecting transactions from Burkinabe accounts. Visa and MasterCard suspended services. But Traoré saw this coming. He had already partnered with regional allies to launch an alternative system, secure, mobile-based, and continent-wide. For every door they tried to shut, another opened. The final humiliation for the old order came during the Pan-African Economic Forum, held in Ouagadougou for the first time. Delegates from over 20 countries arrived, not to lecture, but to learn. Traore walked into the main hall, not flanked by armed guards or suited advisors, but by a group of barefoot students, engineers, and local traders. His keynote speech was just 11 minutes long, but it made headlines across the globe. "We were told that sovereignty was dangerous," he said calmly. "That self-reliance would collapse us. But what they feared wasn't our failure. It was our success. And today, I tell you this, we are no longer asking for inclusion. We are building what they refuse to share." The audience rose in standing ovation. Even some skeptics in attendance admitted they had witnessed something historic. In that moment, Traore wasn't just a leader. He was a symbol of defiance, yes, but more importantly, of dignity. He had taken every threat, every insult, every sanction, and turned them into fuel. Not to burn bridges, but to light the path forward. By the end of the year, 5 African nations had signed formal agreements to explore currency cooperation using Traoré's model. International observers could no longer ignore him. What had begun as mockery had become momentum. What had been called reckless had become reference. And what had once been dismissed as fantasy had become a force, unifying, empowering, and entirely African. This was the legacy of new African money. It was not a currency. It was a call. A call to stand, to build, and to believe. Not in the systems inherited, but in the futures imagined. And at the heart of it all was a young man once mocked for dreaming too big, now watched by the world as he helped an entire continent remember who it truly was. The story of Ibrahim Traoré is not just a political narrative, it is a living lesson in courage, vision, and the cost of self-respect. It reminds us that systems do not collapse simply because someone stands against them, they begin to unravel when people start seeing alternatives. For decades, African nations operated within economic structures inherited from colonialism. These systems were disguised as partnerships but often functioned as traps. Traoré's bold move to challenge the CFA franc and introduce new African money exposed not just the fragility of those structures, but the fear they instilled in anyone who dared to question them. One of the most important lessons from this story is that real change often begins with misunderstanding. Traoré was mocked, insulted, and underestimated, not because his ideas were wrong, but because they were unfamiliar. The world is quick to label young African leaders as reckless when they challenge global norms. It is a form of intellectual imperialism, assuming that sound economics must always come from Western institutions, and that African solutions are too simple, too emotional, or too unstable to be respected. Traoré turned that prejudice into fuel. He proved that clarity of purpose can be more powerful than technical jargon, and that even the most radical ideas become legitimate when grounded in transparency and service to the people. Another lesson is the power of narrative control. For years, African countries were told they needed international approval enhanced as support, but in reality, it was dependency dressed in diplomacy. Traoré shifted that narrative. He didn't wait for permission. He didn't negotiate from weakness. Instead, he showed that dignity could be defended not with weapons, but with ideas. He reminded Africa that it did not need to justify its independence. Sovereignty is not granted by external actors, it is claimed by those brave enough to stand alone. The third and perhaps most transformative lesson is that economic liberation must be cultural to be sustainable. Traoré didn't just introduce a new currency, he involved the people in designing it. He listened to mothers, farmers, engineers, and youth. He translated complex systems into everyday language. He gave ownership of the process to those who would be most affected by it. This approach created a sense of participation that Western models often lack. In doing so, he showed that development is not about copying external formulas. It is about building systems that reflect local values, priorities, and dreams. The backlash he faced also holds lessons. Resistance is not always a sign of failure, it is often proof that you are threatening something entrenched. When powerful institutions moved to isolate Burkina Faso, it revealed their fear, not of Traoré's failure, but of his success. They feared a model that could replicate. They feared losing control. And that fear exposed a hard truth, that the structures which claim to support Africa will often punish it for seeking independence. Traoré's resilience in the face of sanctions and exclusion is a lesson in integrity. He didn't fold. He adapted. He reminded us that survival is not submission, it is reinvention. Perhaps the most hopeful lesson of all is the contagious nature of courage. Traoré's actions inspired neighboring countries. His message crossed borders. Students, activists, and policymakers began to echo his vision. He didn't need to dominate the region. He needed only to be authentic. In doing so, he gave others the permission to imagine. This is how movements are born, not through force, but through example. African unity does not require one voice to speak for all, it needs many voices unafraid to speak at all. This story teaches us that change is never convenient. It is disruptive, uncomfortable, and often lonely. But it is also necessary. Ibrahim Traoré proved that one man, backed by a nation's will, can rewrite the rules. He didn't do it with violence or vengeance. He did it with vision, conviction, and a refusal to remain silent. And in doing so, he reminded a generation that true power comes not from conformity, but from the courage to believe in something better. The lesson is clear, Africa does not need saviors. It needs leaders who listen. It does not need more loans, it needs more self-belief. The continent is not poor in ideas, it has simply been told for too long that its ideas are not enough. Traoré shattered that lie. He taught us that the greatest wealth is not in what is mined or traded, but in the minds of those who dare to think freely, lead boldly, and act collectively. And if we are to remember one thing from his journey, let it be this: the path to dignity is rarely paved. It is carved by those who walk it first.